When I came home from work and saw the package on the front porch, I was filled with an irrational flood of joy. You would have thought I'd received something spectacular, and to me, I had. I'd been waiting for 5 days for Amazon to send the package, and as I brought it inside and cut the tape, I couldn't wait to see how it looked. Reaching into the buffer pads, I pulled out not a game or a new Funko Pop, but a single light bulb and a package that seemed bigger than it should have needed to be. Not just any light bulb, however, but one of those color-changing LED light bulbs. I'd seen them on TikTok and thought they looked cool. They would go through a whole spectrum of colors thanks to the little remote they came with, and I thought the whole operation looked very soothing. I like to watch people lay in bed as the colors shifted, and I thought it might help with my recent mood. I'd been experiencing some heavy seasonal depression lately, and the inclusion of some colored lights might be just what I was missing. I read the instructions and installed the bulb in my ceiling fan, and smiled as I looked at the little remote in my hand. There were so many colors to choose from, and I felt a giddy sense of anticipation. Which one should I try first? Red? Maybe blue? I settled on a light and buttery yellow as I lay in my bed. I felt like I was in some kind of sun. The ones I'd drawn as a kid, it seemed. The yellows were thick, the shade of melted crayons, and I was happy as I lay beneath it in my single room. It had been hard to get out in the cold lately, and this made me feel like I was at the park, under the warm sun at the beach, maybe. It wasn't actually warm, but I could trick my mind into thinking that it was, at least. I lay there for a few minutes, just soaking up the faint sunlight before I got up and went to my computer. As I logged into World of Warcraft for a little gaming, I looked at the remote and decided on a different color. As I explored in the game, I changed the colors to depend on where I was going. The rusty red of Orgrimmar, the deep green of Stranglethorn, the light blue of the Undercity, back to the sunny yellow for the Barrens, and so on and so on. The bulb had a color for every occasion, it seemed, and I really enjoyed playing with it as the evening progressed. I fell asleep that night under the soft, dark blue of a night sky, and I slept better than I had in a long time. In my downtime the following week, I found myself playing with the light, trying out the different colors. I discovered a button for mixing colors and found myself making color combinations that turned my room into all kinds of different shades. I found I liked a few of them. The blue and green combination reminded me of the undersea videos I'd seen on Discovery Channel when I was a kid. There was a red and yellow of the deep desert, the purple-blue of icy peaks, and I found myself lying in bed some evenings after work and just trying different combinations. I fell asleep on Thursday night, the soft blue and deep purple making me think of glaciers, and woke up to a nightmare. I opened my eyes and found myself floating in a room that looked smeared with blood. The walls seemed to hold strange shadows, the reds and blacks mingling like filth in a morgue. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst were the creatures. They were dirty white that was almost translucent, their eyes like lamps as they stared at my prone form. I wasn't sure what to make of them at first, and I wondered if I was dreaming. If I was, this was the most realistic dream I had ever had. Their bodies were long and narrow, like pale reeds, and other than their eyes, they seemed devoid of features. There were two of them, one in the corner by my desk and the other perched in the junction of the ceiling and wall. We stared at each other for some undeterminable amount of time, and I was nearly convinced that I was actually dreaming when my phone chirped and lit up on the nightstand. All three of us looked at the light, and when I looked back at them, the one in the corner of the ceiling had dropped soundlessly onto the floor. The skin around the bottom of his head seemed to rip open to reveal a double row of buttery yellow teeth. His fellow creature did the same, and as the two stalked closer to me on their noodly-looking arms, I whimpered and reached for the bat that I kept beside my bed. As I turned, I must have rolled over on the remote. As the bulb changed back to the same buttery yellow I had basked in on the first day, I came up with the bat out in front of me to find the room devoid of nightmare creatures. I turned it back to the normal fluorescence and looked around in a panic, trying to figure out what had just happened. I was still awake when the sunrise lit the windows, and I wasn't sure I'd ever sleep again with the image of those creatures thumping around in my head. I tried to get about my morning routine, getting ready for work and getting breakfast together, but the image of those horrible things would never leave me. They followed me through my day, dogging my steps as I tried to get my work done, but by lunch, I was a mess. When my boss saw me in the break room, my shaking hands struggling to open my lunch bag, she told me I looked ill and said I should go home and get some rest. "You look ill, dear. Take the day off and have a good weekend. We'll see you Monday." I told her that wasn't necessary, but she insisted. I was grateful for the chance to get some rest, but I found my anxiety growing as I got home, the same place I had seen those horrors. I checked the corners where I had seen them, hoping to find some sign that it had just been a dream, and I was rewarded with nothing. There were no marks on the eggshell white walls, no signs of claws or dirt from the filthy skin of the creatures, but it did little to soothe me. Sign or not, I knew I hadn't been dreaming, and that meant that these things had to be real. The idea that I couldn't see them, that they only existed in the dark, was even more terrifying. But despite my fears, the need to find out what they were and how they had disappeared without any sign just wouldn't leave me. I started by just turning off the lights, but I didn't think that would do much good. I'd woken up in the dark plenty of times, and I'd never seen anything like those creatures. No, I thought, it had to have something to do with that light that I had seen covering the walls. It had changed when I rolled onto the remote, and whatever combination I had bumped had allowed me to see the creatures. I knew about things that you couldn't see with the naked eye, things that were too small or hard to see outside the right color spectrum, and I wondered if these creatures were like that. More importantly, if I could only see them in that spectrum, then was it a two-way street? Could they only see me when that spectrum was on? Might explain why they didn't attack me otherwise. I didn't want to see them. The thought of looking at them terrified me, but I was curious as well. The thought of them followed me as surely as the creatures might, and I needed to be sure of what they were. I was no scientist, not by a long shot, but my desire for answers was greater than my self-preservation in this case. I started playing with different color combinations on the remote, my bat always at the ready. Before you ask, I tried red and black, but it gave me something like a desert cave more than anything. The remote was small, but if you held the buttons, the colors would change further. They would get darker or lighter. They might even change depth and perception, and the combinations really were vast. My computer sat untouched that weekend, my books and TV left to catch dust, and by Sunday, I was a mess. Hadn't slept much that weekend. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see were the faces of the monsters that stalked me, and my rest was pretty thin. When someone knocked on my door, I jumped and looked around fitfully. I peeked down the hallway as someone knocked again, and when Debbie called my name, I realized it wasn't the monsters trying to trick me out of my little cocoon. I didn't even realize I wasn't dressed for company until I made it to the door. I was in clothes that my mother would have called grubs, and my hair was loose and unwashed. I likely smelled. I hadn't showered since Friday morning, and was extremely self-conscious as I opened the door to my apartment. Debbie smiled, bundled up against the cold, and when she saw the state of me, she came right in and asked what was wrong. "Wendy said you had been sent home on Friday with some kind of illness, and I see why now. You look terrible. It's not the COVID, is it?" she said, pulling her scarf up over her nose and mouth. "No, I'm not actually sick," I admitted. "Then what's going on? Have you been sleeping okay? Here." She took egg drop soup out of a bag and set it on the couch. "I brought you your favorite sick soup to help you get past this." I smiled, realizing that I hadn't eaten since the night before, when that delicious steam hit my nose. Bless her. Debbie was a true friend. As we sat, Debbie had brought dumplings to go along with the soup. I told her about the weird creatures that I had seen. Unlike me, Debbie looked excited at the prospect of seeing something different. Debbie was into things like ghost hunting and cryptids, and she loved the idea of actually getting to see one. "Oh my gosh, you gotta let me help. Come on, we'll have a picnic in your room. If this is making you sick, I want to help you see it through." I was glad for her help, but I didn't want to get her caught up in the same crap I was likely getting caught up in. Debbie was my best friend, and the thought of the creature getting her too, all thanks to my damn curiosity, was something I would rather avoid. Debbie, however, was not taking no for an answer. We took the food to my room, and I showed her the remote and the bulb. Debbie scratched her chin as she looked at the buttons, asking if I was sure it was red and black, as she started working through the settings. When I woke up, it was definitely red and black, but it was different. It was greasy looking, ethereal, not quite real. It was like a dream. That's when it took me so long to realize I was awake. Debbie started changing the colors in quick succession, the colors dancing as they went through the spectrum. I was afraid she would burn it out, the colors changing too quickly for my liking, but she just shook her head at me. She said it was fine, they were meant to sustain these kinds of things, and it would speed it up if she just kept flipping through. So, we sat there, eating and flipping the lights at an almost nauseating pace for the next few hours. The sun went down and the moon came up, and as I lay on the bed and played on my phone, I realized it was almost midnight suddenly. I had to go back to work the next day, and I told Debbie I needed to get to bed. "Look, I appreciate your help, but I've got to be up early in the morning." Just a little more," Debbie said, the lights still dancing by. I know I can do it." I rolled over and shook my head, reaching for the remote. "Look, I appreciate your help, but I just don't think it can be done." She moved a little away, still flipping through the colors as I reached, and as I came off the bed, she scuttled a little further back. "Come on, just a little longer. You can be a little tired tomorrow in exchange for a good night's sleep, right?" "No, Debbie, I'm tired. I need to..." I grabbed the remote, Debbie pulling back, and that's when it fell over us. I don't know how, but we were both suddenly enveloped in the aura of dirty red and black light. The walls oozed like fresh blood. The dark hung around them like smog, and I was suddenly aware that we weren't alone. There were more than two this time, their numbers nearly a dozen, as they clung to the walls and the ceiling, like grisly insects. Debbie's mouth hung open, her scream stuck midway up her throat, and I realized this had likely not been what she was expecting. As their mouths split their faces, their teeth huge, my hands shook and my stomach dropped. They fell on us then, and I rolled under the bed without thinking. Debbie's scream came out, loud and strong, and I pulled my knees to my chest as I tried to think about what to do. They were killing her. They were killing my best friend, and the only thing I could think of was changing the lights back. It had worked the first time. Maybe it would work now. I looked around, finding the remote on the ground, but as I reached for it, I saw the giant yellow eyes find me. One of those noodly arms came reaching for me, and as my fingers found the plastic face, I pushed the first button I could find and snatched it away from the sharp teeth of the creature. The light turned to something like normal before it popped loudly, and I was left in darkness. I got out my phone and switched on the flashlight, looking around and finding nothing but the ruined remains of our picnic. By the light of my phone, I discovered that the creatures were gone, but I also discovered that Debbie was gone, too. I've ordered another light bulb, but it won't arrive until tomorrow. I paid for express shipping, but I don't know if that'll be soon enough to save Debbie. I don't want to see those things ever again, but if there's a chance that Debbie's still alive, I have to find her. She wanted to help me, and now it's my turn to try and help her. So be careful with your new light bulbs if you buy one. You may see more than you bargained for, and you may lose more than just the cost of shipping. It all started with a trip to the bar. Some friends had invited me out after work for drinks. Given that we all work at the steel mill in this 2-stoplight rural town, that meant we were going to Dusty's. Dusty's is what's colloquially called a dive bar, but it's the only bar we have in town. It's a little roadhouse where you can drink watered-down beer, listen to country music, put some money in the jukebox, play some pool, or hit on the 7 or 8 half-dead barflies that are there every night. If you go to Dusty's for the atmosphere, then you're going to be disappointed. Most of us went there to watch the guys who worked for the town's only other reliable business, the logging company, drink too much and get in fights with people that are unprepared to stand toe-to-toe with them. That night in question was what you would call a slow night. I'd had about 3 pitchers of cheap beer, and the only fight we had seen was when someone's wife came in to drag him away from whatever tart he was talking to by the stage. Neither of them had been particularly skillful brawlers, and when they finally decided to just beat the crap out of her husband and drag him out of the parking lot, I told the guys I was going to turn in early. It was creeping up on midnight, and the bar was deader than usual. Dude, no way you're going to get a cab this late at night. You might as well stick around. Why wouldn't I be able to get a cab? Sandy's runs till 3 in the morning most nights. Charlie, the guy who had told me I wouldn't get a cab, leaned back on his stool so he could look at me. My cousin Dwayne says the cabs won't come out this far after 10 o'clock. They've been having trouble with people going missing. I rolled my eyes, walking my stool back so I didn't fall off of it. I was drunker than I thought I had been, and I didn't want to fall over in front of my friends. Yeah, I've been hearing those stories since I was a kid. Tell your cousin not to believe everything he reads on the internet. I took a staggering step towards the door, catching the bar with my hand as the room spun a little. Nah, Charlie protested. This is pretty recent. They say that the cabs have been arriving to pick up fares, but when they get there, no one is waiting. It's a big mystery, and no one's really sure what to think of it. I scoffed at him, not really in the mood for any of that. I staggered out of Dusty's, taking out my cell phone as I tried to Google the number for Sandy's. I'd used it often enough that you'd think I could remember it, but in my current state, I couldn't remember much of anything. After 2 or 3 failed attempts, I managed to get the number in and got the receptionist after 3 long rings. Sandy's Cabs, how can I help you? Yeah, I need to get a cab from Dusty's bar. I'd heard the clicking of keys on the other end of the phone, but when she learned my location, she seemed to change her mind. I'm sorry, sir, we don't pick up from Dusty's anymore. I glowered at the phone, not quite sure I had heard her right. What kind of small-town cab company doesn't pick up from the biggest bar in town? How come? I asked. It was deemed too detrimental to our clients. I guess Charlie had been right. Okay, well, where can I catch a cab? There was some furious clicking, and when she came back, she almost seemed to be whispering, as if something might hear her. There's a bus stop down by Richmond. The company has said that it's the closest to Dusty's that will pick up clients. Richmond? It's almost 5 blocks from here. Sorry, sir. If you want a cab, then that's where you'll have to go. I considered just going back inside to wait for the others, but decided I was ready to leave. A walk would probably do me some good anyway. Fine, I'll meet them there in 30 minutes. The dispatcher said that she would dispatch a cab, and then promptly hung up on me. With that out of the way, I began my walk along the shoulder of the rural road. Fortunately, the weather was pretty good for early June. The pine trees on the left side of the road, the side I was walking on, made a skittering sound in the wind, and it sent a chill down my spine. The thick swab of pulpwood trees seemed to stretch on for miles, and the farther I walked, the more it felt like something was watching me. It was little more than a tickle on the side of my face, the slight attention of something that I couldn't really see, but the farther I went, the more the regard rankled me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just feeling creeped out after a long walk in the middle of the night, but I heard the pine needles crunching lightly beneath something and decided to speed up. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or a fox that I had disturbed up, and it would leave off after it got a sniff of me. They were more afraid of me than I was of them, and once they realized it, they'd take off. The farther I walked, though, the more I thought about the disappearance that Charlie had talked about. I wasn't much for news. I didn't even have a cable subscription, but I was shocked that I hadn't heard anything about these kidnappings or whatever they were. The thought that there might be something watching me from the woods with intentions of making me its next victim made me speed up a little more. I had to stop myself from running as I ate up the road. What would I do when I got to the bus stop if there was no cab there? Would I really be able to just sit in the terminal and wait while whatever was out there kept watching me? I shook the feeling off, feeling silly. It was just a raccoon or a possum or something. Just because it seemed to be going in the same direction I was didn't necessarily mean it had ill intentions. I tried to ignore the soft sound of indignant pine needles as they broke underfoot, but the farther we went, the harder it became. It was just an animal, I told myself. I had just disturbed it in whatever had brought it out tonight, and now it was curious of me. It would go on its way soon. It would leave me alone if I just ignored it. I kept telling myself that, but the further I went, the harder it was to believe. It seemed to be stalking me from behind the dark forest, a predator intent on man flesh. It looked like some kind of hunting cat, its head boxy and its body sleek and long. It slunk quietly along behind me, plotting its attack as it prepared to spring. That was stupid, I told myself. There was nothing there. I was just making myself paranoid. I was imagining the sound of large, flat paws on pine falls. I was creating the slightly elevated breathing of the animal. If I turned now, I wouldn't see anything but the shadows and the pine trees. I tried to make my head turn, but my neck seemed unwilling. I remembered something that my grandma had said once when I was a kid, and her voice rustled through my mind like a ghost. Some things don't like being seen, and when you see them, you can't take it back. When I saw the lights of the bus stop, I almost broke into a run. I made myself walk, however, because things like that love to chase, too. As I got closer to the bus stop, I became aware of someone sitting in the lighted shell. As I got closer, I could see it was a woman, her head down and her body abnormally still. I wanted to call out to her to warn her about the thing that was following me, but as I moved closer to the stop, I realized it had broken off its chase at some point. I breathed a sigh of relief, laughing at myself for psyching myself up. It had all been in my head after all, and I had never really been in any danger. As I came into the light of the bus stop, I almost laughed, my smile hard to hide. "Something funny?" asked the woman, lifting her head to look at me. My smile soured a little. Her voice sounded strange in the bus shell, and I worried that I might have offended her. "No, it's just I was worried about something, and it appears to have all been in my head. I was mostly laughing at myself for being foolish." I realized now that I was here that she was sitting with her knees against her face, and she had leaned her head against her knees as she turned to look at me. She was a stringy thing, older teens or early 20s, and her hair looked oily as it hung about her face like filthy drapes in a rundown trailer. She was dressed in something that had once been a sack or maybe curtains, and I wondered if she might be homeless. Worst of all, she had a smell about her, a smell that was not altogether pleasant, a smell that reminded me of my grandfather's smokehouse after hunting season, of the remains of animals left behind that smokehouse. "What was it?" she asked, her teeth looking too big in her mouth as she smiled. I was afraid of being stalked by some kind of hunting cat," I said, surprising myself by speaking at all. "A cat? In this part of the world?" She scooted a little closer to me, a minute movement, but too much for me. This part of the world is more accustomed to bears, I hear," she said. As she scooted this time, I scooted away. Like I said, it was just a feeling. "What kind of feeling?" she asked, scooting again, though I couldn't figure out how. Her arms were around her legs, her knees against her cheek, and she seemed to have no means of scooting at all. It was, I stuttered, my mouth suddenly very dry. "It was like being Red Riding Hood while the wolf stalked her." At that moment, I was as sober as I had ever been. Between the creature and the girl, all the drink had been burned out of me, and I suddenly wondered if the creature might have left because it smelled her. Her smile threatened to cut her cheeks. "I imagine that was exhilarating. Did you enjoy feeling like the prey for once? Did your blood demand that you run, but your mind insisted that walking would be safer? Did you know how much I wanted to chase you?" My heart was pounding, loud enough for me to hear it. She had just admitted to being the one that was stalking me. She couldn't have been the thing in the woods. There was no way. She had been here when I arrived. There was no way she could have dogged my heels through the woods and then gotten here before me. It was impossible. My brain told me these things, but I found it harder and harder to believe as she slowly backed me into the side of the bus shell. I wanted to run, but I knew that was what she wanted too. "You thought you'd be safe once you made it to the light, didn't you, manling? Little did you know that monsters don't always shrivel in the light." She was very close now, her legs coming down as she unfurled herself. She was bigger than I had thought, her body thin and long as she pulled herself onto the bench. She was on all fours, that grin very disconcerting as it came closer. She was feral looking, some wild woman from the depths of a dark jungle. As she prepared to spring, I saw a pair of headlights pin her to the spot as they approached us. I did run then. I ran from the bench and threw myself into the cab, telling the man to drive before the door was even shut. He looked confused, turning back to the girl as if to ask if she needed a ride too, but his confusion didn't last. The color drained from his face as he got a look at her, and he yelled for me to close the door. He pulled off with a squeal of tires, and we both watched the woman as we drove away, her smiling face getting smaller as she watched us. I leaned against the seat, panting as I tried to control my galloping heart. He had to try a couple of times before I could hear him over the blood pounding in my ears, and when I finally made sense of it, we were turning around to get back on the route. "You got very lucky, fella. More lucky than you know." I asked him why I thought so, and he told me a story I'll never forget. A couple of nights ago, I got a call to that same bus stop to pick up a fare. Dispatch said he sounded weird when he called, like he'd been running, but his car had broke down near the stop, so he figured he had just been pissed off about his luck. I pulled up about 20 minutes later and found not a middle-aged man fuming over his car, But that same girl with the Cheshire Cat grin on her face, she looked up at me as I came to stop, and I just knew that if I got out of my cab, they'd never find me again. The area near Dusty's is supposed to be off limits, and after tonight, I don't think Sandy's will be picking up out here until the situation changes. I've been sitting in my living room, hands shaking as I write this, but unsure of what to do now. I called Charlie before I got into my apartment, but I don't think they really believed me. Charlie was pretty drunk and sounded like he thought I was making fun of him. I hope they make it home safe, but it's that dangerous smile that I can't get out of my mind. She's out there somewhere, waiting for her next victim, and I feel very fortunate to be able to tell you my story and not be a squib in tomorrow's paper. My husband Thomas is a writer of short horror, and I'm very proud of him. He crafts these unique little tales about horrific situations, and people really like them. I won't name drop here, but you may have read some of his work if you've been in the community for a while. He writes a lot, and his stories have been read by a lot of different narrators. Recently, though, things have changed. He's been thinking of narrating his own stories for years, but he just never thought he was up to the task. His voice won't play well with the audience, he says. No one will want to hear someone read their own stories, he says. His stories aren't very good, even though he makes money writing them. He has thousands of excuses, but finally I told him to just try it and keep his expectations realistic. He gave it a try, and from the first video, things have been great for him, but very strange for me. You see, when my husband records videos, he becomes someone else. It all started with Dr. Winston and the Hospital of Horrors, a series my husband writes. Dr. Winston is a stuttery little guy, someone who's afraid of his own shadow, and when my husband does his voice, it doesn't even sound like him anymore. I've never actually seen him do the voice. Not really. We have a 2-bedroom apartment, so he sets up his studio in the bedroom since our son has the other room. He bought one of those green screen curtains from Amazon and some wall foam to cut down on the reverb, and he pulls the curtain and sits behind the screen as he works. Sometimes I'll sit in bed and listen, hearing the story unfold, and the first time I heard that whispery little voice come from behind the curtain, I had to get up and peek and make sure it was just him back there. His voices are spectacular, and soon he had a dozen or more of them. Lenny Drover, Dr. Winston, Ozark Uncle, Raymond W. Sanders, Dr. Summer, just to name a few, but it's the Terrifier that I hate to hear. Tommy Terrifier is a reoccurring villain in his story. Tommy is a creature that hunts children after dark, and sometimes leaves them skinned alive beneath trees or on benches or somewhere else where people will find them. He's the antagonist of Corbin Banner, an Atlanta detective, and has become a fan favorite. The people just love the voice he does, the deep, resonating voice that speaks of horrible acts and terrible deeds. I sometimes put my headphones on when he reads stories about Skinner Park, but I find that the voice of Tommy the Terrifier still bleeds through my AirPods. Don't worry, little one. I'll make it quick. You won't feel a thing. I'll snatch your skin so fast. You won't have time to... Stop! Stop! Please, no! I shouted one evening, and my Thomas threw the curtain back and looked at me in alarm. What's wrong? Are you okay? He asked, the chair falling over as he stood up. Yeah, sorry. I must have dozed off and had a nightmare. He snorted and gave me a cuddle, going back to work as I turned up the volume and tried to ignore the horrible voice he used. We went to bed not long after. The audio finished for the evening, but when I woke up sometime later, I saw a light out of the corner of my eye. There was a ghostly glow from behind the curtain, and the edges billowed slightly in the breeze from the AC. He'd left his setup on, the curtain usually covering his workspace, and the chair was lit in the backdrop of the computer screen. I could swear there was something more behind that curtain, but I didn't have my glasses on, and I couldn't see it clearly. As I watched, the chair seemed to glide as it swiveled around. The curtain rustled ever so slightly at the bottom, and behind that gauzy barrier, I could see someone hunched in the chair. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. They saw me seeing them, and when he smiled, it was like bugs on my skin. "Hello, Poppet. Fancy a stroll by the old canal?" I felt my breath hitch, my throat cramping as the terror spread through me. It was him. It was Tommy Terrifier. It was him, and he was just beyond the curtain. When he stood up suddenly, his height imposing despite his obvious age, my throat opened and the scream I loosed sounded like a tornado siren. My husband came awake violently, reaching for the bat he kept by the bedside. He believed that there was an intruder, that something had woken me up and scared the hell out of me. He was out of bed and looking for the source of my fear, and when I pointed to the curtain, he looked confused. He pushed the curtain aside with the bat and revealed nothing but the chair and the glowing screen of the monitor. I tried to explain to him what I had seen, but he just kissed my forehead and told me I must have been dreaming. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I found myself watching that curtain, waiting for the creature to return, praying it wouldn't get me if it did. As the sun came up, I finally slipped off, waking up a little later when the smell of lunch being cooked hit my nose. The bed was empty except for me, and Thomas had packed his green screen up after last night's scare. I could hear him in the kitchen, whistling as he cooked something on the stove, and I crawled out of bed as I reached for my robe. It was Sunday, and our son was likely at someone's house, which would leave the two of us the day to ourselves. I would have plenty of chances to rest, the night before already a hazy memory, and as I crept up the hall, I tried to cover my mouth as I got ready to startle him. My husband, for writing such scary stuff, is kind of a fraidy cat. He puts on a spooky deep voice for his videos, but he's a big old scaredy cat in reality. My favorite thing to do is startle him, something I probably do too often, but as I came into the kitchen, he must have heard me. He never looked up from what he was cooking, but I heard a terrifyingly familiar voice just before I reached out to grab him. "Careful now, Puppet. You wouldn't want to startle me at my work." I don't know if I slipped when my foot came down, but when I hit the floor, I was already backpedaling. I was scooting away, my fear returning, and when he turned to look at me, I could swear his face had changed. Gone was the beard and glasses I'd grown accustomed to, the thin lips and the green eyes I loved. His face was pale and clean-shaven, his skin pockmarked and cratered. His teeth grinned shark-like from his mouth, thin and needle-like, and I screamed and covered my face as he took a step towards me. I flinched and struck out with my fists as he touched me, and when I saw that Thomas was looking down at me with concern, I felt confused. When I saw the trickle of blood coming from his nose, the confusion turned to shame. "Jesus, I'm so sorry. I didn't think you'd react that badly. I didn't mean to scare you. I heard you creeping up on me and thought I'd startle you a little for a change." He apologized as he helped me up, but that was only the beginning. I didn't sit in the bedroom while he recorded anymore, but that wasn't the last time I heard the voice of Tommy Terrifier. I I heard it wafting from under the door, inserting itself in my ears as I tried to block it out on the couch in the living room. More terrifying still, I heard it in my husband's voice as he went about his day-to-day life. It was little things at first. Tommy Terrifier had a noticeable British accent, and I began to notice the way my husband pronounced certain words. He never noticed, but there was an inflection on certain words sometimes that made my skin crawl. When I mentioned it to him, he just looked at me strangely and said it must be something he wasn't aware of. Our son, Nathaniel, didn't seem to be able to hear it either, though. When I mentioned it to him, often right after it happened, he would shrug and say that he couldn't hear it. No one but me seemed to be able to hear the odd inflection he put on, and I began to feel like they were both messing with me. The other thing was that he started calling me Poppet. First I thought it was something he was doing on purpose, but when he kept looking at me strangely anytime I brought it up, I began to doubt. It was like he didn't realize he was saying it, and my upset confused him. We were having problems at this point, fighting over my perceived treatment, and his lack of understanding honestly made it worse. The straw that broke the camel's back, though, was the sleep talking. Thomas had never talked in his sleep. He barely even snored, but suddenly he was talking in his sleep almost every night. Well, it wasn't really him talking. It was Tommy Terrifier who was talking to someone as Thomas lay sleeping beside me. He always just called them Poppet, the name Tommy gave the kids in the stories before he killed them, but it was also the name he'd been calling me for weeks now. As I lay there listening to him talk about all the grisly things he meant to do, I realized that he might be talking to me instead of some random kid he was dreaming about. Sometimes he would turn his head and look in my direction, and I could feel his eyes behind his lids looking at me. I wanted to wake him up, but by now I realized it wouldn't do any good. He would just think I was having mental problems or something, and the fights would continue. I moved to the couch that night, and when he found me there in the morning, I told him I was having bad dreams and I didn't want to wake him up. Not long after that, he told me about a new angle for the show. The fans have really been liking the series, especially Tommy Terrifier, thinking about changing the show up so Tommy reads the stories sometimes. I might get more audience interaction, kind of shake up my listeners a little bit. I tried to be supportive of this, but I was not pleased to hear that Tommy would be making more appearances in his makeshift booth. After that, every third or fourth story was narrated by Tommy Terrifier. Then it was every other. As the voice became a regular part of his show, the night talking got worse. He would say the most depraved things I could barely believe my normally sweet husband would say. He would talk for hours about skinning people alive or pulling out their teeth, and I would lie there in terror as it all just played out around me. I'd taken to using sleep meds so I could get to sleep before him, but sometimes that voice would follow me into my dreams, and I would spend my nights in a state of constant terror. Sometimes I couldn't get to sleep before him, but even from the couch, his dark words seemed to find me. I came to realize that this wasn't something he could help, and I stopped bringing it up. He was so excited about his channel that I hated to put a damper on his enthusiasm by telling him how it affected me. Engagement was way up, he would say. He had more subscribers than ever, he would say. People were commenting how much they loved Tommy Terrifier, he would say. Ad revenue was at an all-time high, and maybe he could cut back at work and take more time for the channel, he would say. On and on and on about how people liked that terrifying voice of his, and I would nod and agree and tell him how great it all was. Meanwhile, I was a nervous wreck in my own home, waiting for the next encounter with Tommy. Before long, the show became Tommy Terrifier's Terrifying Tales, and Tommy began to make an appearance in every episode. That's when I began to notice the physical change in Thomas. He was spending more and more time in our bedroom, the door closed and that terrible voice creeping from beneath it. It wasn't just me hearing it now. Nathan had begun avoiding the back of the house, spending more time in the living room than usual when he was at home. I asked him why, but he wouldn't tell me. He said he hadn't been sleeping well lately, and I can relate. He's been sleeping on the couch with me sometimes, and we both shudder when the voice of Tommy Terrifier slips down the hall. That was a week ago. Now the only time he leaves the house is for evening runs. He says it's when he gets his best writing done, but I've come to doubt his words. He always comes back sweaty and disheveled, and his stories have taken a very dark cast. They've become less horror and more horrific. The mutilations and violence have reached a new level, and all of it is delivered by the voice of Tommy Terrifier. He doesn't even sound like himself when the mic is off now. His normal voice has begun to appear less and less, and I'm afraid that one day that pale creature will come out of the bedroom instead. It's getting late now, and though he hasn't come back, the police have come asking questions. They questioned everyone in the neighborhood at the start of the violence, but they had some very probing questions about my husband tonight. Where does he run? When does he run? Had I noticed any strange behavior? Did I notice a change in his personality? Apparently, some of the stories he's been writing lately have been a little too similar to the murders in the park, and the police want to bring him in as a person of interest. I told them he was out running and they could find him in the park. After they left, I put the chain on and waited for him to come back. He hasn't returned, but I woke up to hear a familiar voice coming from the bedroom. It seems there's a new story to be told tonight, and the sounds of Tommy Terrifier sound almost gleeful. I don't know what to do. I'm not even sure how he got back inside. I want to leave, but I'm frozen in fear as I sit on the couch with my son. I don't know if I'm more afraid that the voice will continue or that it will stop. Because if it stops, I'm not sure if I might not become just another one of those tales he reads for his audience every night. The job at the gas station was a blessing when they called me, but it would become something of a megrim before I finally quit. I worked the closing shift at the Fill and Go for the better part of 8 months, and it was 8 months of making coffee, stocking coolers, and listening to weary women with too many children argue about what you could and couldn't buy with EBT. My first job was construction, working as a carpenter's assistant until I was 16, and after the big layoff during the pandemic, I was tempted to go back. The amount of construction work hadn't changed, but the call for laborers had waned, it seemed. Suddenly, I was forced to look elsewhere for work, and my savings were starting to get dangerously low. That's when the Fill and Go finally called me. The worst part about the job wasn't even the job itself. Not really. The worst part was the walk home when the day was done. I live in the Shady Oaks trailer court, about 3 blocks from the gas station, and it just made sense to walk to work. I didn't have a car. It was one of the first things to get repoed when I was out of work, so if I needed groceries or booze or just a bite to eat, I was walking. It wasn't much of a problem. I liked to walk, but it was the sights that made the walk unbearable, especially at night. Walking past Orwin Woods in the middle of the night was enough to give anybody the shivers. Orwin Wood had existed long before the children's home that had given it its name, but the long-gone orphanage is why it was infamous. Established in 1890, Orwin Children's Home was a place for cast-off children from all over. The rambling plantation home, lovingly donated by Mrs. Orwin before she died, boasted 30 acres, complete with a barn, field for growing, and a pond for fishing and swimming. and a lot of room for rowdy growing kids, of course. At its peak, it had held some 120 kids, and had been a place of new beginnings and fresh starts for many of the lost boys and girls in the area. Those were not the reasons it was remembered, however. The reason it was still whispered about at fireside stories was the fire of 42. By 1942, the orphanage had finally fallen into disrepair. They had some 30-odd kids they were caring for, and the consensus was that the fire may have been set for reasons of insurance fraud. Others claim it was a candle that was left lit in a bedroom, or a stray spark from the fireplace. But however it was started, the results had been devastating. 30 people lost their lives in the fire, 25 of them children, and that was when the stories began. You could still see the ruins of the children's home as it hulked in the undergrowth, reclaimed by the forest after the blaze, and the area around the hulk was supposed to be very haunted. Lots of people had seen ghostly apparitions, handprints on the dirt on their cars, or had toys glide into the road without warning. The Orwin Woods played in a lot of local legends, and it was widely agreed upon to be a haunted place. I explain all this so you understand why I might have been a little eager to get home on my evening walks. Nothing strange had ever happened to me, nothing besides that feeling of unseen eyes watching me, at least not till last night. Last night, I got off work to find about a foot of fresh snow on the ground. I'd been expecting it. I had been watching it come down all day as I rang up coffee and gas for customers. I had walked to work through flurries earlier that day and had dressed accordingly. Still, I thought as I pulled my hood up and turned to lock the door behind me, that wouldn't stop it from being a cold, wet walk home. The dark gas station disappeared behind me as I started schlepping home, tonight's cigarette already between my teeth. It was a terrible habit, I know, but it's the only vice I can afford to have these days. Tonight, however, I was having a hell of a time getting the tip lit. Every time I would lift my lighter to spark it, the wind would pick up and blow my little flame out. Cold as it was, however, the shiver that passed up my neck had nothing to do with it, as I came even with Orwin Woods. I tried not to look as I walked past, the forest a dark shadow on my left. Like almost any night, I could already feel those phantom eyes as they marked my passing, and I kept my gaze firmly ahead. My grandma had always told me that when you sense the supernatural taking notice of you, it's best not to let it know you see it. Some things don't like being seen, bug. Remember that, she would say, and it made a lot of sense on nights like tonight. I was still trying to get the cigarette to kindle, but the wind was keeping me from my evening smoke. I put a hand up to block it, but it seemed my fingers weren't even good enough for this capricious gust. The unlit cigarette was a good distraction from the creepy woods, however, though maybe a little too good. If it hadn't been for the snow, I would have walked home without incident, but I suppose I could have also unknowingly let something follow me in, too. Suddenly, I was done with the games. I was jonesing for a smoke, and I bent almost double as I tried to spark the tip. 3 clicks and a lot of cursing later, I managed to get the flames to stick. But as I took that first long drag of gaseous pleasure, I noticed something beside me on the sidewalk. It was a pair of footprints. No, not just any footprints. A pair of children's footprints. I don't mean shoe prints either. I could count the individual toes in these prints, and there was a line of them beside my much larger ones. I didn't know when they had picked up my trail, but I didn't really care either. Whoever had made them had disappeared, and I looked around curiously. It was 22 degrees outside, so my phone said when I left the station, and I was looking for the kid bold enough to walk barefoot in the snow. There was no one, though, and no footprints going hastily away from mine either. I was alone in the snow, though the fact that they had stopped right next to my own let me know I might not be as alone as I thought. I glanced back, wanting to see I'd been mistaken, and that's when I saw the second set. They had stopped about 5 feet behind me, but they were just as plain as the first ones. As the wind hit me again, I tried to keep my teeth from chattering. The The chill I felt had nothing to do with the weather, and I found my eyes drawn to the new pair as they waited patiently for some sign. 2 perfect pairs of tiny footprints, sitting placidly in the powder. Then before my eyes, a third set came crunching towards me, and my cigarette made an angry hiss as it hit that fresh snow. I was running before that third set came even with the second, and this seemed to be the sign they'd been waiting for. I heard those bare feet as they slapped wetly on the concrete behind me. My head cried out for caution. It would be very easy to take a tumble out here and get hurt, but my desire to get away was up and my adrenaline was coursing in the face of that formless threat. I slid as I rounded the corner, but my sneakers held purchase as I kept showing my heels. I could feel the burn in my chest as I ran, my breath steaming like a loco as I ran for my life, and I knew if they caught me, I would never see home again. None of the stories I ever heard about the woods spoke of children hurting anyone, but by the sound of those ghostly feet, I guess they weren't going to sell me cookies. By the sound of it, there were more than a dozen of them after me, and I could just imagine the intention of this legion. I saw the trailer park coming into sight, but that seemed to be where my luck ran out. I came off the curb, running flat out, and when I hit a patch of ice, I stumbled and went down hard on my outstretched hands. I was lucky, I suppose. If I'd hit my head and gone unconscious, there's no telling if I would have ever woken up again. As it was, I just gashed my hands on the concrete beneath. I could still hear them behind me, getting closer and closer, and I walked on my hands and knees until I got across the street and managed to right myself. I was running up the narrow walkway, dashing between the trailers as I saw my faded red one coming into sight. I prayed the stairs wouldn't be icy, and when my foot touched down on the first step, I was rewarded with a groan and the firmness of unfrozen wood. I darted up the steps, crossed the porch, and rammed the key into the lock as I frantically walked into the entryway. I sighed in relief. I was home, and nothing could hurt me here. I turned and slammed the door, the screen door not feeling quite firm enough, but my hands stopped. I saw my breath as it came puffing out, and it felt as if it were thicker than usual. There were dozens of footprints in the snow outside my trailer. Some were in the yard, some were on the porch, but all of them led to the front door. It was as if all those kids had followed me home, each of them beckoning to be let inside so they could come out of the cold. I could just picture a dozen or more half-burnt children, the snow falling on their ruined skin, looking hopefully at me as if just asking for a place by the fire. It was all too much, and when I slammed the door shut, there was a note of finality to it. I made a mental note to try and find a new route home, but the situation, it seemed, had fixed itself. I was awoken at 6 a.m. the next day by my boss, telling me that Dixie, his day manager, had called to tell him that she quit this morning. Run off with her damn boyfriend and good riddance, I say. You've been a solid night guy, but I figured I'd offer you a chance to come work days if you want. The position comes with an extra $3 an hour, but you'd have to start today. You interested? I was, and the forest seemed a lot less spooky in the daylight. I haven't encountered any more phantom footprints after that night, but I'll never forget how that ghostly mob chased me home one cold February night. I'm a cop in Nevada, for a tiny town of less than 1,000. Courteny, Nevada doesn't actually have a police force. The mayor is usually whoever's soberest at election time, and it's made up of retirees and people trying not to be noticed. It lies between Austin and Eureka, and the whole town is managed by a single officer. Me. I live in Eureka, but 3 months out of the year, I stay in the dingy little Palmer Inn and operate the emergency phone system. It routes to my cell phone, and when I'm not out on a call, I can be found in my room, watching TV. The Palmer actually gets really good satellite TV. You probably think it sounds like a post from hell, but the crime rate in Courteny is next to nothing. I've been doing this on and off for about 3 years, and I think I've only had to reach for my gun twice in that time. We do 3 months on and then swap with another officer for 3 months, but sometimes I'll just do 6 months in a row. Courteny is as peaceful as a town full of oldsters and whatever else can be. After tonight, however, I'm not sure I can look at the place the same way again. I'm trying to write up paperwork now, but I'm just not sure what to say. There's no way they'll believe the truth, but I swear it's what happened. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. I'm hoping that if I write it out here, then it might be easier to explain to my supervisor. I was sitting out on the town line with my radar gun at about 10:30 at night, when the quiet town suddenly got less quiet. So the only thing really to do in Courteny to justify me being there is to catch speeders on Highway 50. The speed zone changes from 65 to 35 in the course of a mile, and the number of drivers that seem to think they can just blow through the little town doing 60 is way too damn high. I had a rig of my own invention that held the speed gun up to the window, and as good a hiding place as I could behind an old billboard, leaving me basically unseen and my hands free to watch whatever on my phone. I had foregone the adventures of Luffy and the crew in favor of a new horror podcast, and I was getting comfy when something hit the ground hard enough to rock my cruiser in its frame. My phone fell into the floorboard about a second before the speed gun came down to hit me on the head, and I came out of my car rubbing my scalp and cussing like a sailor. I got out and looked across the street, seeing heat shimmers as something cooled in the desert nearby. The oldsters who lived here had told me that meteors were sometimes seen falling out into the desert, but this one had damn near taken my cover out. I had never seen a meteor up close, not unless you count the ones at the museum that my school had drugged the class to when I was a kid, and I was interested in getting a good look. It would be kinda cool to see something that had been cruising through space until a few minutes ago, and I made my way across the road and towards the crater. I was still in the road when, to my surprise, I heard the sound of metal grating against itself. I could see the top of something dark as it rose from the lip of the crater, and the top was still glowing from its entry through the atmosphere. The hole wasn't terribly deep, but this would have still been taller than me by a foot. Would have been a shame if one of those aforementioned speeders had come blowing through while not paying attention, because I would have been roadkill. I was about 60 feet from it, but it looked like one of those NASA spacesuits, except made out of silver. When it moved, it was the herky-jerky kind of steps of a sci-fi robot. You know, the ones you might see in a 50s movie. It slipped in the sand a little, but managed to find its footing as it made its slow way out of the crater. If it noticed me, it gave no sign, and when it came to the top of the hole, it turned and started making its way for town. I hadn't noticed before it got on solid ground, probably because the sand was running down to quench it, but when it stepped, its footsteps left little fires behind. It made it easier to follow, and as I went back to the cruiser to get my radio, I realized I had no one to call right about the time I keyed up the mic. I was here by myself. I was the law in Courteny, and it was up to me to do something about this. I dropped the handset and climbed in instead, keying the engine as I pulled out and followed the strange creature that had crashed randomly on the outskirts of the little burg. It wasn't hard to follow him. His feet left little fires behind him, and his pace was slow, as if he weren't really in a hurry, as he made his way closer and closer to town. Watching him go, I wasn't really sure what to do with him if I tried to stop him. Could he be stopped with anything in my car? I had a shotgun, my sidearm, and a couple of those flashbangs we used on large groups of people. None of that seemed like it would do much against this metal man who was slowly making his way through the desert. Watching him move was like watching a stop-motion short. He was kind of a strange automaton, a metal man whose skin was still slightly red from his fall from space. Instead of pulsing and burning, as his steps had, he seemed to shimmer like a heat reflection. He didn't seem lost, his pilgrimage definitely going in a certain direction, and as the lights of the quick fill broke the darkness with their phosphorescent intrusion, I began to get a little nervous. The quick fill was a 24/7 gas station that boasted 12 gas pumps and a huge underground holding tank. God only knew what would happen if this thing set fires that went down to the reserve tank. I whipped into the parking lot as I popped the trunk and grabbed my shotgun. It had buckshot in it, a higher caliber than the 9mm slug in my Glock, and when I hefted it, it felt like I had 4 shells ready and waiting. There was a box of 12 in the trunk, and I put them in my jacket pocket before chambering around and taking the safety off. I didn't know what this thing was capable of, but I knew I couldn't let it menace my town. "You, all right, Sheriff?" Came a shaky voice from the door of the quick fill, and it startled me enough to almost make me drop my shotgun. Clyde Haggerty, the 19-year-old kid who ran the register at the quick fill after 10:30 p.m., looked pretty scared. He had probably watched me come screeching in, pop the trunk, and go digging for my shotgun, wondering what the hell was going on. In his mind, it was probably robbers or dopers, but he had no clue what was coming out of the desert for him. I didn't want him to see this thing suddenly vaporize me with a death ray or something, and when I turned towards him, he jumped back a little as the barrel of my shotgun flagged him. "Go get yourself somewhere safe, Clyde. Something's heading your way, and I don't want you to get mixed up with it." Clyde nodded, and I heard the door click as he went back inside. Hopefully, he was hiding in the cooler or something. I turned back to find the creature lumbering closer, its distance now about 50 feet from me. The shotgun wouldn't do much at that range, but that would give me enough time to follow protocol and give it a warning before opening fire. "Stop! I'm an officer of the Eureka Police Department, and I'm ordering you to halt and state your intent." The creature didn't even pause, just kept its course as it made for the gas station. "Stop! This is your final order to stop, or I will open fire." It was well within range now, the fires burning behind it, making it hard to miss, and when I squeezed the trigger, the gun bucked as the shot slammed into it. The metal man never slowed in his pursuit, and as I loaded another round, it was now about 20 feet from me. "Stop!" I yelled, squeezing the trigger and pumping a new shell into the barrel as the old one thundered forth. A third shot let fly a second later, but if the creature was even registering them, it never showed it. It kept coming as I fed new shells into the gun, and as I slid the fourth into the receiver, I felt a sudden and excruciating heat. It was like standing too close to a bonfire, and as I stumbled away from the thing, I looked up to find that it was within 10 feet of me. It appeared that it was still very hot, and its skin radiated an intense heat that the sand had done nothing to quench. I yelped again as my fingers blistered, and I realized the gun was soaking up as much heat as I was. I tossed it down, and not a moment too soon either. The bullets in the weapon began to erupt, sending the shotgun flying apart. As I turned away and covered my face just in time, I caught some shrapnel in the arm and a little in the back, but I was spared the worst of it. As it lumbered past, I tossed the shells out too, lobbing them as far as I could manage before they went off as well. Even so, I was reminded of a time as a kid when I'd reached for something underneath the radiator while it was still on. Even though I'd been careful not to touch it with my face or hands, I could still feel that heat coming off of it as I stretched for a toy that I had lost under there. It was like that now, except this thing was a walking radiator. It went right past me and towards the gas station, its course unerring. As it came around the side, I remembered another weapon at my disposal and ran back to the trunk of the cruiser. I had a fire extinguisher in there, one of the big ones that I'd needed to put out a trash fire once, and as the creature came around to the front of the store, I pulled the pin and sprayed it with a stream of foam. It coated the thing, hissing as it hit its superheated skin and sliding off like the cheese on those copper pans that are always showing on TV. It was impossible to tell if it was doing anything, but as I played it out, I heard a hellish sound coming from the front of the store. The thing had reached out and melted the glass on the double doors, walking through the hole as it went right into the quick fill. There wasn't much I could do but follow him. I didn't know where Clyde was, but I hoped that he was safe. The store looked empty as I followed at a relatively safe distance, and the front counter was vacant. It appeared that Clyde had taken me seriously, and as the creature stumbled into the little shop, I found myself spraying at fires left in its passing. He went by the chips, the candy, the snack cakes, all of them curling a little as the heat kissed them. He was making his slow way towards the drink cooler, and he seemed to be looking for something in particular. As he stood looking in, the floor bowed and sagged beneath his otherworldly warmth. I was worried that he would go right through the floor at this rate. When he reached out, slowly and deliberately, his hand melted its way into the cooler, and the puff of angry, cold air that came out was almost comical. It hissed against the creature's skin as it reached in for something, and when it came out with a bottle of Dr. Pepper, the container was already starting to warp. It tilted it towards its head, spilling the dark liquid all over itself, before reaching for another one. By the third bottle, they had stopped crumpling quite so quickly, and by the seventh it was clear that it was tossing the liquid into whatever served as its mouth. It ran through the whole row of them before starting on the Diet Dr. Peppers, and as it finished the row too, I noticed its skin was less translucent than before. Some of the heat shimmer had left it, some of the blazing warmth had dissipated. It was cooling down, and as it dropped the mostly intact bottles to the ground, it released a very human sigh of relief. Then it fell to pieces on the floor of the quick fill, its body reduced to scrap. And that was the end of my encounter. I'm still not sure what to make of all this. The creature landed on Earth, tromped through the desert, destroyed my shotgun, wrecked up the quick fill, and then drank until he turned into scrap metal. Dr. Pepper, to be exact, but who's counting? I don't know if my supervisors will accept this or not, but I do have something they can use as proof, besides the crater on the outskirts of town. Every step that he took through the desert left behind a perfect little footprint of pure glass, and the glass has a tread in it. I've saved a few of them, just in case, and Clyde has provided a witness statement as well. Apparently he was hiding in the cooler when the creature came in, and saw it drink all the Dr. Pepper before collapsing. Hopefully, that'll be enough to convince my supervisors I'm not crazy. But I hope to never have another night like that one again. Something else comes to mind too, and it makes me hesitant to go to the fridge for my favorite midnight drink of choice. If my fire extinguisher did little more than kick up steam, what's in Dr. Pepper that quenched his heat so well?